Hello and welcome back to the book of Galatians study. My name is Rose Ramandi and we are in chapter 3 of the book of Galatians. So let's start reading this chapter and we dive deep into the scriptures. So chapter 3 of the book of Galatians verse 1 says, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed among you as crucified." Okay, so we know the story. We've been studying the book of Galatians and we know that Paul is trying to convince this church finally to believe it's not by the works of the law. It's not by doing the law. It's not that you receive the salvation or anything from God because you just kept the law or something. It's actually because of the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ. And all of a sudden, after he talks about it in verse 21 and he says what he told Peter, he's telling the Galatians what he told Peter, and then all of a sudden now he's back. He's like talking to the Galatians and says, now I'm talking to you, oh foolish Galatians. Why is he saying foolish? Because they are trying to perfect something that will never be perfected through the works of the law. Okay, and the reason he says foolish, because when you step into the law and you start doing, or you think the work of the law and all this stuff, it has a wisdom behind it. Honestly, there is a sound, there is a wisdom behind this law, and when you hear it, and so many times that when we hear it, we think how wise this wording is. And Paul, in the letters to Corinthians, he says, you know what? It's the cross of the Lord Jesus that is the wisdom of God. And that kind of wisdom brings to foolishness all the other wisdoms. And to be honest with you, when you want to keep the law and do the law, let me tell you this, it makes sense and you want to do it. You're like, yeah, it's logical. It's, because our mind and carnal mind tries to understand and tries to put things together, and finally we make a decision and we think, oh yes, this is good things to do. Do you remember that Eve in Genesis chapter 3, after the serpent gave the fruit, the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil to Eve, she said she saw that the fruit is good and can make her wise. So that's the story of the law and grace. And Paul comes to the picture and says, you foolish Galatians, you think you are wise going back to the law, trying to make things perfect, because he talks about it the next verse. Let me just read this and then we'll go through some verses here together. Look at verse 3. It says, "Are you so foolish, having begun in the spirit? Are you now being made perfect by the flesh?" Do you see what happened here? They started in the spirit. They received the spirit. But somehow they went back to the law, okay? And they went back to the works of the law and tried to perfect things in the flesh and not continuing in the spirit. But now look at verse 1 again. It says, "Who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth?" Okay, now I want you to think about it. Okay, so if you haven't thought about this sentence, just maybe even pause the video right now and think about it. What is the truth in the context that we are reading? Okay, don't just, we know that it's Jesus Christ, but what is the truth that Paul is talking in verse 1, chapter 3. You want to pause the video? Go ahead and pause the video and come back. Okay, so here's the thing. Paul is trying to, the verse before that gives the answer. It says, "I do not set aside the grace of God. For if righteousness comes through the grace, then Christ died in vain." And then all of a sudden he says, "Why don't you obey the truth?" Okay, so the truth is actually the grace of God. All right, so keep that here in mind as we move on, because Paul is trying to make people understand that what happened on the cross is actually the grace of God that brings justification for mankind. So now here says, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed among you as crucified. Cross off the word among and then replace it with the word in. Before whose eyes Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed in you as crucified. In you as crucified. So Jesus Christ is portrayed, or the word portrayed is also has the meaning of riding before somebody's eyes, riding something. So therefore Paul here says something happened, and there was an eyes that was opened, and then now you started seeing something. What you saw was that Jesus Christ is crucified in you. So all these things that Paul is talking about is in you. Why is he saying who's in front of whose eyes? Jesus Christ. Because if you remember when we go to Genesis chapter 3, that after they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, their eyes are open and they saw that they are naked. Okay, do you remember that verse? And hopefully, go to Genesis chapter 3 and read it again and again and again and again if you need to. So they ate it, and now all of a sudden their eyes are open to themselves. But here Paul says, your eyes are open to see Jesus Christ. Do you see? There is a shift that happened in the seeing of mankind. When man eats from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the eyes of man is open to himself. Eve ate it. As when we say man, we are not talking about man as a male. We're talking about mankind, human beings, okay? So now here says, your eyes are now open to something else. What is it open to? It's open to him, to the Christ that is now crucified in you. Oh, that's interesting, right? Because we always think that the Christ is crucified somewhere out there 2,000 years ago on the cross or something. But now all of a sudden Paul says, no. This Christ that we are talking about is inside of you. How do we know? Verse 20 in Galatians chapter 2 told us when we were studying in the previous video. It says, let's read it again together. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me, and the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God. So it says the life that I'm living right now, it's because Christ lives inside of me. I don't live that law by the works that I'm supposed to achieve and do, but actually I believe in the faith of someone else who did the work that was pleasant to God, who completed it, and I live by that kind of faith. So the Christ that is in me is the Christ that is both crucified and resurrected. Do you remember in the previous video we talked about two eyes? One eye that is dead and is crucified, and there's another eye that we have, it's actually resurrected and it lives. Okay, so let's come back here. It says that this Jesus Christ who went on the cross is portrayed right before our eyes. And if you remember, Jesus said in the book of John, and it says the time has come for some kind of a judgment, and that is that I have come that the eye that see might be blinded, and the eye that doesn't see might see. Going back to Genesis, the eye that saw, which wasn't supposed to see, and it was supposed to be blinded, it's the eye that saw the lack in himself or in herself, right? But now that eye must be blinded, and now the other eye has to open to see something else. So do you just see Paul is saying, okay, the reason you are keep going back to the law and trying to perfect things in the flesh, it's because your eyes is seeing yourself. And if your eyes are seeing yourself, it's just the result of a knowledge that you just ate. And the knowledge that you ate is not the knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ. If it was, you would have seen him. That knowledge that you just ate is the knowledge of good and evil. And the law gives you that knowledge of good and evil. And you see, it's just a cycle that we go through it, and it never ends, and it keeps producing the power of sin into our lives. And it keeps bringing us back to where we started and never seeing basically any fruit of righteousness or salvation. So here it says, okay, you know what? Your eyes got open and you saw something else. Now, let's continue reading and see what happened here. Look at verse 2 in Genesis chapter 3. It says, this only I want to learn from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law or by hearing of the faith? Okay, so Paul went and preached the gospel to the book of Galatians, right? And he basically told them, he preached the gospel and they received the Spirit and they got baptized and, they came to the Lord. And Paul says, okay, if you received the Spirit, how did you receive the Spirit? Is it because you did something? Was it the work of the law you did? Or you heard a message of the gospel, then you believed that, and because you believed that the Spirit came upon you. Okay, so I guess the answer, the answer must be that we received the Spirit because we believe. It was by faith. We didn't do anything to receive the Spirit. But now, I want us to just link these two verses together. Do you see the verse 1 says that in front of whose eyes Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed in you as crucified, and then the next verse says you receive the Spirit. Okay, so therefore what we see here is that when you receive the Spirit came in you, and it was the Spirit that who opened up your eyes to see that Jesus Christ is crucified in you. Okay, that's the first step, because okay, you know what, let me just share my screen here, and thankfully I have my previous picture that we talked about it last week, and I was going to remove it and I didn't, and I'm happy I didn't deleted it. So the thing is, if you look at the picture here, you see it says, okay, when you receive the Spirit, that was the beginning of the faith for you. That was when your eyes was open and you realized that Jesus Christ basically was portrayed crucified inside of you. That was the beginning. That's what you saw the first thing that happened. That's when you realize, oh my goodness, he did it. I was crucified. I am crucified with Christ. It was me. It was my dead work. It's the old man that went on the cross, okay? So going back on my screen here, so that's why. It's not by the works of the law. It's by the hearing of the Spirit. Look at verse 3. It says, are you so foolish, having begun in the Spirit? Again, before we continue, are you so foolish? Because they thought it's really wise. Why do you think someone like Peter, who was the apostle of the Lord, who walked with Jesus, okay, he walked with Jesus, he told Jesus, I give my life to you. Why do you think he went back to the law? Do you really think that he thought, oh, law is bad and all the things, and oh well, let me just go back to the law? No, the reason is it sounded so wise. It sounded so liberating. It sounded freedom. It sounded so true. That's why he went back to the law. So that's why here Paul says, you foolish. How foolish you are. You think you are wise And let me just bring that picture of the crucifixion of Jesus one more time, so you can see that it's not the wisdom that you have, it's actually the foolishness. So having begun in the Spirit, are you now being made perfect by the flesh? Okay. So therefore, they started in the Spirit, which I'm going to talk about it a little. They started in the Spirit, but they didn't perfect it or finish it in the Spirit. They actually went back to the law and tried to make things perfect in the flesh. Let me just share my screen one more time. If you look at the screen, I'm going to use like a different color here for you to see. Let's just say this kind of green. Okay. So it says, okay, you start here in the Spirit, but now if you go back to the law, do you know what happens here? You go back to the law. That means you're crucifying the Son of God again. You're insulting the Spirit of grace. You're saying grace couldn't make it perfect. What Jesus did on the cross wasn't complete and wasn't perfect. Therefore, I have to do something about it. I have the power to do it. I can do a work that is marvelous, that can bring salvation for myself. And what Jesus did, it becomes vain and will never profit you, because you are relying on the works of your own hand and never trusting the work of God, that is the work that God is doing in you, which the next verse is going to talk about it. Let's read it. So you started in the Spirit, Paul says, why are you finishing in the flesh? Look at verse 4. Have you suffered so many things in vain, if indeed it was in vain? Okay, so that's the question we have to ask. All right, why is it Paul is saying you suffered so many things? Right? Like imagine, like the word suffering that we have for ourselves, this word suffering is like usually is associated with pain and death and all the stuff that we live in the flesh, okay? But Paul here says, okay, you started in the Spirit. Where did that start of the Spirit happen? When the faith started. When does that faith start happening? When you come to realize, when you start seeing that Christ is crucified. Let me just switch back here on my screen, and maybe this is the perfect place. Okay. So what do we have here? We have, okay. Then we have a cross here. Okay. We have Christ crucified. Okay. And then it says, what happened was you were here under the law and under sin. Okay. So you were under the works of law. All right. But then you got to the end of this law, and then you, by faith, you stepped into something powerful, which is called faith, which is also called, the whole thing is the grace of God. So the beginning of your journey into this life that I live, not by the works of the law, but by the hearing of the faith, and I've in the faith of Jesus Christ, started when you saw Christ crucified. So crucifixion of Jesus brings you to the end of the law, but it brings you to the beginning of faith. Okay? So that's why it says, when you started in the Spirit. So let me put it here. So when the works of the law is ended and the faith starts in your life, this is the start and receiving of the Spirit. And this is the walk of the Spirit. So Paul here says, you know what? you started in the spirit. Now, why do you want to go back to flesh? And all of a sudden in verse 4, he says that, have you suffered so many things? So now I want you to take a look at the picture here. What kind of suffering Paul is talking here? Paul is saying, guys, this is what happened. So you were the old man under the law, and then all of a sudden you went on the cross, you put an end to that old man, you killed that man of sin, you killed that old person inside of you, and now you're living a life that is filled with God's grace and the Spirit and faith and life and all those amazing things. Have you suffered so many things in vain? What kind of suffering he's talking about? This kind of suffering. Let me just circle, and hopefully you're seeing it. This kind of suffering. What's the kind of suffering? You went through this, believing. You put on the end. You are crucified with Christ. Do you think this is not a suffering? You are putting an end to the Adam life. You are putting Adam, the old man, to the cross. You are nailing that old man to the cross. You are getting out of this mindset and the wisdom of the world. You are, getting out of the fleshly lifestyle that you have, that is controlled by your feelings, by the knowledge of good and evil. Your whole life, you lived that way, and all of a sudden your eyes are open to Christ and Jesus, and you realize, oh, there is something called crucifixion. I gotta go through it. I have to put an end to this life. And now here says, which life? The life that we used to have in the law. And now I have to keep persevering and walking and keeping my eyes on this person who finished the faith and continue walking in faith. Paul calls that suffering. I don't know if you've ever walked in faith. If you ever walked in faith and stood until you received the reward of your faith, until what you believed for came into your life, then you know what these verses are talking about. Because once you believe, it's not the end of the story. The moment you start believing, it's the beginning of your story. It's the beginning of the faith. But there is something called perseverance, continuing in what you believe in, continuing in the Spirit, until that faith becomes perfected inside of you. And this process of endurance and perseverance is not an easy journey, because you are being constantly having opposition from your own thoughts, from your own, feelings, from your own beliefs, from the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil you ate some times ago. And now it's just bearing fruit in your life and all these things. And you are following Jesus. And let me tell you, it's just a narrow way. I thank God it's a narrow way. You know why? Because the moment you enter into this narrow way it squeezes you, and it gets everything out of you that needs to be out. All those beliefs and everything. And I honestly, so many times we think, okay, I believe, and then we go frustrated walking around why things are not happening, okay? And not understanding that faith is a journey. Faith has a beginning and faith has a perfection. And that's why Paul here says you started in the Spirit, and that means you started in the faith. So along the way somewhere, probably you thought, maybe this is not working. Maybe I need to do something else about it. Maybe we should keep the law. Maybe I have to do this. And before you know, you're back to the flesh where nothing is justified, where there is no life. And actually, it's the power of sin. So now look at that. Look at verse 5. It says, Therefore, he who supplies the Spirit to you and works miracles among you, Does he do it by the works of the law or by hearing of faith? Let's just make a little correction here. So the word he who, therefore he who, just cross it off. It's not there. So this is how it should read. It says, therefore, the supplies of the Spirit to you and the works of miracles among you. Again, it's the word among here is the word in you. Write it down. I'll come back to it. The supplies of the Spirit to you, the works of miracles in you by the works of the law or by the hearing of the faith. Do you know what it says? It says the supply of the Spirit in you and the work, the miraculous work that is happening in you. Is it happening because of the work of the law you did, or it's happening because you heard something and it's by the hearing of the faith? So it's not talking about he who does it, which God is talking about you who receive the Spirit, and this Spirit working miracles in you. Is all these things are happening because you did something or because you believed something? Okay. So now again, do you see it says the works, and works miracles in you, or the work of miracle in you. Going back to verse 1, what happened in you? Verse 1 says, Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed in you as crucified. Going back to verse 5, works miracle in you. Okay, so there is a Spirit that is in you, and this Spirit is working miracle in you. And then verse 1 says that actually this Spirit is portraying Jesus Christ crucified in you. So do you see the work of the miracle here that is happening? Okay, so I know all those miracle works that we are talking, but what miracle greater than Christ crucified and Christ resurrected? So here it says the Spirit that is in you is working miracle. What is he doing? First of all, he's opening up your eyes to see that Jesus Christ is crucified in you. Okay, so let me just share my screen here. Maybe this is better. Okay. These two persons that we have here, okay, sorry. Okay, so these two persons, let me just use another color, this one. This is you, and this is you. Okay, but this one is the old you, and this is the new you. Or as we talked about in the previous video, the I, old I or the new I, okay? But both of these are in one person. It's not that you have there are two of you somewhere out there, okay? It says there is a person in you that must die, and there is a person in you that must be resurrected. So this person that is in you must die only to see that, oh, Jesus Christ is crucified, and then I realize that I have been crucified with him. So the Spirit works miracle number one, opening up your eyes to see that I have been crucified with Jesus Christ, because that being portrayed clearly in me to understand that when Christ died, then I died. The second miracle that this happens in you is that I no longer live according to the work of the law, but I live according to the faith of Jesus Christ. Okay, so that's the working of the Spirit. That's why it is called faith. That's why it is called, the grace of God, because that's the Spirit that is working in us miraculous work to show us the crucifixion of Jesus that took place inside of us. And that means when he died, it was me and the old man died so that I can live. So you see the work of the Spirit. So now let me just show you here one more thing I wanted to show you here. So you're here, you start in faith. And then you go through this journey of faith. Okay? And then what happened is there's something called that this faith comes to end. That means not it's finished, it's perfected. And that's when this justification that we are talking, the salvation that we are talking, or the promises that we are receiving, that's where it's received. I'm going to put down salvation. Okay. But let me just bring this to a very simple understanding. There is a time you're here and you make a decision. You say, by faith, let me just wipe it out. So by faith, when you are here, you step into the faith and you say, you know what? This is what I want. You are here, okay? But then you see yourself here. You're not there yet, but you say, you know what, I want to be there. Then you make a decision, and then you go through something. I call this temptation, or the Bible calls this temptation. Do you know what happens? When you go through this temptation, two things can happen. Number one is that you're like, okay, go back to where you were. Or you're like, no, when I was there, I already make a decision. I'm going to keep pushing forward by faith and believing, and I'm not going to overcome this temptation by flesh. Do you know what our problem is in number one? In number one, when this, the temptation comes, usually what happens is we think maybe we are in the wrong path. That's why we start thinking maybe there's something wrong with it. Then we go, let's go and do something about it, and you change your way. But you just need to remember, when you were here, you were seeing clearly, you were in faith, you planned it, you decided, you chose your way. You said, you know what, I want to get here. When you are here, you need to remember who you were here, why you started it, how you started it, so you can continue here. When you were here in number one on this side, let me just put it here. When you were here, you knew what kind of path you want to go. You made the decision. You realized that, okay, it's not by the works of the law. It was when you realized it is only by faith. Why is it that somewhere along the way through your faith journey, you thought maybe the faith is not enough and I have to do something about it? That's why Paul is writing and says, okay, don't be foolish. You go through these times, you go whatever happens, the doctrine comes, it sounds like wisdom. But ask yourself a question. When you started it, why did you come to this path? Why did you start? How did you start it? This is the way out of every temptation. Because, we all make decisions in our clear mind when there is no temptation, when there is no weakness, no emotion attached. We make a decision and we go forward. And all of a sudden things happen to, the temptation comes and everything that is opposing the first decision that we made or believed. But that's the way out of it, that to remember that why did I make that decision? When I made that decision, why did I believe it? And if you recall what brought you here in this path? You realize that it's by the faith and the Spirit, then you won't find yourself back to the law, okay? So hopefully this concept, that understanding can apply in everyday life, honestly. It can apply to everyday life. Every decision that you make. How many times you made the decision? You are excited about the decision you made. But when the time came for you to really start and step into the decision you made, the feeling came and the fear came or whatever came, and you never made that decision. You never did it. Because you forgot why you made that decision. And if we go back to that, Paul is saying, you started in the Spirit. Don't go back and try to make things perfect in the flesh, okay? So that's why in the next video we are going to see that this promise of God to Abraham is not going to come through any works of the law that we do. And Paul brings us to the picture and says, you know what? The whole gospel is based on the promise and not on the law. And if you want to receive the promise, you have to step where Abraham stepped, okay? So we will see you in the next video.